Preservation is more than just wanting to keep a building around. There are multiple factors and considerations that go into keeping your favorite historic buildings up and functioning.
Because that's one of the things I enjoy most about historic preservation is that, like a mystery, you're unfolding a mystery of a building and getting it to tell its story and finding out more and more and peeling back the layers.
Welcome back to the last episode of our mini-series celebrating Preservation Month. This is What's the Scope with Finegold Alexander Architects, the podcast where we share our hands-on approach to projects and how we love to celebrate design that is boundless. My name's Madison Mercado, I'm your host and a marketing coordinator at the firm. On this episode, we have two more staff members who are incredibly passionate about preservation, and we're exploring their perspectives and boots-on-the-ground experience working on different projects at the firm.
I'm Christopher Lane, principal of Finegold Alexander Architects. I've been here for 30 years, believe it or not. Boy, time flies. So I'm an architect, a musician, a tinkerer, a surfer, an adventurer. Always got something to do. No moss grows on me.
I'm Steve Walnut. I am an associate and senior project manager at Finegold Alexander. I've been here a little less time than Christopher, at only 3 years. So I'm somebody who enjoys historic things, history, places, books, knickknacks, everything else. And it's been one of my things that it's been constant throughout my life. So looking forward to getting into this discussion and talking more about historic preservation.
Great. I wanted to start with a question about Finegold Alexander specifically. So the firm has done quite a bit of historical preservation projects in the last few decades, really, of the history of the firm. When you joined and then eventually worked on some of these projects, what drew you to the process in each project, and what did you like about them?
Well, I guess I could say, having been here for a large part of those decades, I've seen a huge variety of projects, and certainly joining here, preservation was the furthest thing from my mind of what I would be doing. But when I joined the firm in 1994, the first project I worked on was the Chelsea Sartliff School Early Learning Center, which is a historic building in Chelsea. That we really spent weeks of research gathering existing documents, documenting existing conditions, and even identifying artifacts that we were going to reuse within the building to kind of tell the story of the building. For me, being in spaces that not everyone gets to experience in a way an architect does is something I've always valued. And it wasn't until further in my career that I really realized that. To stand in a building where people did 200 years ago and take all that in is something I take a lot of pride in. While the approach is more or less the same, the means of documenting have changed exponentially over the last 30 years. It's really been an incredible journey since starting at Finegold, seeing the way we approach historic buildings, the way we document them, and the way we develop them.
For me, I came at this sort of later in my career, and in this one where I already knew that I really liked historic preservation and had a lot of experience. So one of the reasons I interviewed and eventually got the job at Finegold Alexander was because of that focus and that interest in it. And jumping right into projects sometimes in the middle of construction or middle of design, like the First Church of Christ Scientist or the BU Kelashant Hall project, felt like coming home to me because those are the projects that I really enjoy, I have a lot of experience with. And I think the process of learning that, even if I'm coming in later in the process, it's exciting because that's one of the things I enjoy most about historic preservation is that it's like a mystery. You're unfolding a mystery of a building and getting it to tell its story and finding out more and more and peeling back the layers. So being able to get into that and also take advantage of other people who've already peeled back the layers it's enjoyable. It's great to see that process and also see the process that the firm has because we've done so much historic preservation for decades that it's not just like you're coming to it new, they're coming to it from a place of this is what we've done and we've done well for many different times.
Christopher, you kind of mentioned that our preservation didn't really come into your career in the beginning. It wasn't something that you initially thought you were going to do. But what was there like a specific project or something that made that switch where you did want to work more on preservation?
Well, it's interesting because it does predate joining Finegold Alexander 30 years ago. Certainly in school where we had a lot of projects to choose from as we were doing things, there really wasn't the opportunity to work on existing buildings, and restoration preservation really wasn't a class to be taken. So really my first project out of school when I was with a different company was a restaurant group that designed restaurants throughout Boston. They had purchased an old historic firehouse that we converted into a restaurant in DC. And that was really my first exposure to a historic building and renovating it and reusing it for a different purpose. And the whole digging and researching about what it was and how it was built and how we were going to renovate it was a really appealing thing to me at the time, and it was something I hadn't experienced before in architecture. So as I continued developing restaurants and stuff with Back Bay Restaurant Group, and then moved on to Finegold Alexander, that was really the first time that I felt I was doing something very relevant for our future environment, our future built environment, and how important it is to be restoring our existing fabric and maintaining the memory of our history.
Right. That's really important for a lot of communities. How about you, Steve?
Sort of the opposite. Like, I think it's funny to think about this when you're talking, that I came at it from a different direction, where looking back on growing up, even before I was in architecture school and then architecture school, there's always been that historic preservation background to it, even if I wasn't really aware of it. Like studio projects where I was like, hey, I'm going to use this building and I'm going to do a renovation and inhabit it, and even my thesis was that. So I think there's always that background to that, and so looking at it from a standpoint of backwards, I was like, oh yeah, no, that always made sense to me, and I always had that interest in history from like growing up, and so there's a linear process throughout where historic preservation has been a constant. I've done from new projects, but it's always something I come back to.
That kind of goes into my next question about how you approach a project. What are the aspects of a building that you can tell will make for a better preservation project than others, as opposed to like tearing it down?
That, Steve, to start?
I'm going to say it's not necessarily about the building itself. It's about the people that you're working with. If you're working with somebody who has this long-term idea about what they want to do, or have this value of history and the building, that's going to be a successful project because you're in alignment with what they're looking for. I've seen sometimes where people like, oh, I have this existing building, what do I do with it? And they don't really care about it so much, so that's a much more difficult project. But when there's somebody else who's a partner for you, who loves the building as much as you do and is really a partner in that, that's really when things come together really well. Because otherwise, if you're not in the same alignment, it doesn't come out well, honestly.
Yeah, and it's seconding that. I mean, really a thoughtful client that has the drive to preserve the building is a lot different than a client that has to preserve a building.
Right.
And I mean, it doesn't hurt if the building has good bones and it's been well maintained along the way. I mean, with all of that, I mean, I'm hard pressed to find an existing building that doesn't offer something in value relative to preservation or adaptive use.
No, I absolutely agree with that.
So, both as project managers and people who might be a little more boots on the ground on these projects, what are some of the technical or mechanical considerations to preserving a building?
So really, key consideration in preserving buildings is defining and understanding the timeline relevant to the restoration approach. Oftentimes, historic buildings have gone through previous renovations and adaptations. And it's important to understand the relevant period to which we're restoring to. And this sets the datum to which preservation goals and execution answer to. We need the check and balances as we're moving through restoration to really anchor us to a timeline. Without this approach, it can be unclear where the priorities should be. Cable mill built in 1873, for example, was a historic wire and cable manufacturing complex comprised of 8 original buildings, growing to 15 buildings by 1930. After researching and documenting a series of renovations and additions that occurred over the complex's existence, it became clear what year we were restoring to. As a result, 7 buildings were demolished to restore the complex to its 1873 splendor.
I think building off of what Christopher said there, I think understanding the period of significance is really important, but it's also, as an addition to that one, understanding how the building is constructed, why it was constructed, and then also using that as a baseline for any additions. So if you're looking at a mass masonry wall, if you're saying, okay, well, we want to add insulation to that wall to meet current energy codes, you have to understand how that wall is going to behave or behave differently than it was originally designed, so you're not creating more problems. And kind of really understanding like the type of mortar, like what type of mortar are we using here, because the bricks are going to be softer the older you go. And you don't want to put a hard mortar because all of a sudden you're going to do the opposite of preservation. You're going to be doing destruction. So I think really having that technical knowledge, or at least knowing who to ask if you don't know about that technical knowledge, that's a really important part, because if you don't know what you're doing, you can actually do more harm than good.
Where does that technical knowledge come from? Like for knowing what maybe each decade has used in the past?
I mean, and I guess each person's experience is going to be different on that. For me, it was mentorship. When I joined the firm was so deeply rooted in preservation and adaptive use that there was always somebody there bringing you along. I mean, I didn't become what we call an expert in preservation and restoration as known in the firm overnight. I didn't go to a class for it. It just naturally happened as you moved through the firm as the years went on by.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's kind of the traditional way that architecture gets passed down. It's the apprenticeship. The school is there, but it's really this apprenticeship and learning from that. It's from colleagues, it's from mentors, it's from consultants, and it's just your own experience going out in the field. I think for both of us, we're still learning something new every day from being in the field or going to conferences or talking with consultants. It's an eternal learning process, because you're always going to experience something new. You're like, okay, I've never experienced this before. How do I learn better about what's going on here? And then you learn from there, and then you use that the next time where it comes up again.
Right, I see. How do you ensure designs that both preserve the important parts of a building and also promote longevity and making sure it's modern and up to code at the same time?
We were talking about something like this the other day, and a lot of times you put it like it's letting the building speak to you, because I think buildings have a personality. The more you deal with them, the more you have a personality. And when you try and do design, and if it's fighting you on it, it's telling you that doesn't work. But if you do something and all of a sudden it fits like a puzzle piece that slots into it, it's listening to what the building has to say. And I think that's how you can develop a design that is complementary to the existing building, has its own function, but in reality, both pieces gain something from each other. And it's like a symbiotic relationship that happens.
Yeah, I mean, and in that same vein, I mean, it's really about establishing the important parts of the building and renovation, as well as concurrent understanding of the modernizing required. From there, the efforts is really to find a commonality and a contradiction between the two and formulate a design approach that synthesizes both of them. But I think one thing, and whether it fits into this question or not, but that's always been key to me with existing buildings, is understanding that within every challenge, there's a concealed opportunity. And with every opportunity, there's a revealed solution. And we just need to find the right one along the way.
Like a solution in how the people who use the building later on can use it better.
That would certainly be one, and a forward-thinking solution rather than the solution at hand of how we're going to combine the new modern part of the building with the old existing, being respectful of the fabric. And we haven't said this yet, but often what comes up is that what we're doing is reversible. Not that it may ever be reversible, that we're touching the building and modifying it for modern needs and requirements. But if you could imagine that you were going to take all that away someday, then what's left? Is the building itself still preserved in its original historic nature?
Right. Because most of the times when we go in front of these historic commissions, they are going off of the set of rules set up by the Secretary of Interior Standards on Preservation. And one of those for historic preservation is reversibility if you're putting on a new addition, anything else. So, and those are the rules that oftentimes that we are asked to design to.
Right. Can I just ask as an aside, why do they want to reverse, like if they were to reverse the, whatever you did to it, what's the point?
I think there's a concept, I'm trying to remember why they wrote this, that you're adding something to it. That building is historic, and therefore that has, in their minds, a greater value. So if something in the past were like, well, we want to restore it back to its period of significance, like truly restore it, that you can't have something where if in taking away the new part that you've added, the rest of the building falls down or it is completely destroyed of its value. So I think they build that in so in case theoretically you ever need to do that. But it's also acknowledging that preservation is an ever-changing thing. So what once was acceptable as preservation is sometimes we look back and sometimes horror about what it is. The earliest examples of preservation were sometimes people doing things that didn't ever exist on buildings and say, well, I think it should be like this. And we now look back at that and say that's not the right way of doing it.
Right, and I would also add that, in my opinion, it's always been like what we're doing now to the existing buildings, and this may be a generalization, but won't stand the test of time that the historic object has already stood and will continue. Like adding a glass partition or something to an existing exterior, to an existing masonry opening with an ornamental jamb and pediment and what have you. Long after that glass window is removed and replaced with something else, as we renovate the building again, that existing stone will stay intact. So as years and years go by and we continue to renovate the same building, establishing the parts and pieces that remain unchanged is important.
I think it goes back to what you're talking about the longevity, where it's the historic portion that has that built-in longevity.
Right.
So, Christopher, you worked on the Boston City Hall Council Chamber renovation, and it recently became a local historic landmark.
Yeehaw! Yes, finally.
I know a lot of people were really waiting on that one.
Yeah.
How do you feel your work in the chambers contributed to the preservation of an urban and brutalist style?
Well, I have to say, in school, I was always a huge fan of the brutalist style. Can't say why. I mean, I loved concrete. I loved the simplicity of it. Designing and renovating within it is a whole different story. The council chamber renovation was really a balance of repairs, modernization, equality, public and barrier-free accessibility, all in the historic, sensitive space of an unforgiving concrete environment, celebrating a brutalist style. I mean, several key moves, like inserting a raised floor to address barrier-free access to the main level while providing necessary pathways for infrastructure, removing one of the existing concrete half walls to address visual accessibility and provide physical access to podiums for public speakers, adding drapery to address acoustical issues, all while respecting the existing finishes by expanding on them, allowing the completed renovation to appear as though it had always been there. It was definitely a challenge, and I can remember when we looked at taking down concrete wall, the chamber being surrounded by half walls, at what a big ask that was going to be. I mean, that was definitely a big modification to the space, but it worked, and the way it ended up being designed within the context of the existing railings and bronze and wood, it looked like it had always been that way, and it appealed to the now modern demands of the public as well as staff within the council chamber.
I find the effort at the Boston City Hall and the fact that it became a landmark, which was overdue for happening. It's fascinating because there's a change in preservation. You can see it evolving. 20 years ago, as you said, the idea that Boston City Hall would be a landmark would be absurd. There was such a period where people they loved it when it was originally there, I think. But then over time, the brutalist and that type of architecture fell out of favor and had been really sort of slandered for the most part by a lot of people. Because it is not everybody's cup of tea, but it's sort of coming around now where people are seeing the value of that architecture the further away they get from its inception or kind of its unfashionable period on that. And it's also indicative of a lot of challenges we're seeing now for those buildings, because a lot of these modernist buildings are now becoming 50, 60, 70 years old, and we're having to do historic preservation. But the traditional historic preservation rules, which is dealing with construction types that were very old and well established for a long period of time, don't always line up. And so we're having to find new ways to preserve, and how do we do this, and figuring that out. So like the council chamber, putting in wiring in an old Victorian house, not that hard. You just have to chase through the plaster. Going through a modern building where it's cast in place concrete, a lot more difficult.
Indeed. And I think that's one interesting thing about preservation. And it's taken me years to realize it. You're so focused on doing it, the next project, the next renovation, the next restoration, is the inventory is never going to run out. It's just always changing. So what was considered an old building but not historic 30 years ago is now historic. We're restoring and reusing buildings that we never thought would be restoring or reusing 20 years ago. So it's just interesting to see how the inventory just rolls over and keeps growing, and how the approach is and what the historic product is each year or every 5 years.
We'll probably end up working on some of the places that we worked on in the 90s or the 2000s. Well, at least me.
Well, and I mean, not to bring my own personal home in, but we just moved to Amesbury in February, and it was built in 1928. And in my head, that's not historic. I mean, we're so used to working on these 1800s, early 1900s homes, buildings, mill buildings and such, that the idea that a 1920s home is considered historic goes towards that whole thing, that the inventory is ever changing as we move and advance through the years, as we all get older. And it's our responsibility, as we have newer staff joining the firm, to do what the predecessors did before us and educating them on the value in preserving our environment and renovating and restoring it.
Thank you for listening to our very first mini-series of What's the Scope with Finegold Alexander Architects. If you want to learn more about the firm, please visit us at faainc.com. Also follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Finegold Alexander Architects to find out when the next mini-series drops. This is Madison Mercado, and thanks again for listening.